One of the most fascinating things about the writings of the Apostle Paul is how he drew metaphors from everyday life in the Roman Empire to speak into the Christian walk. But the problem is, for many of us, we don't understand that Roman Empire, and so we miss the deeper meanings that he intended. In fact, we dedicated an entire conference to helping people understand Paul and his Roman world. Myself, Brad Nelson, and a dear friend of Walking the Text, Dr. Randall Smith, walked our audience through all the ways in which Paul is employing these metaphors in order to help them to understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus today. And we wanted to make these teachings available to you. So in this first episode, I launch into the theater, a powerful venue for shaping culture. And so we're going to talk about how did the theater function, how is Paul interacting with it in his writings, and what does that mean for us today? So Life in the Roman Empire, Part 1, here we go. We're going to talk about something that every respecting Greco-Roman city had. They had a theater. And this is an artist rendering of the Acropolis of Pergamum of the first century. So for those of you who study Revelation, one of the seven churches, and on the left here you see a theater, and in a moment the camera is going to swing around and you have all of these different things up on the Acropolis, but a central feature of every respecting Greco-Roman city is the theater. That's the theater from the other side now. Steepest theater in the entire ancient world, held 10,000 people. And it is acoustically off the charts. I can stand and do from right here, and everybody up here, if I'm speaking in a normal voice, can hear me crystal clear. It's remarkable. And this is every single Greco-Roman city had a theater. So here is one at Hierapolis, which is near Colossae and Laodicea. This is Athens. We jumped ahead. Let me see here. Go back a moment. Oh, we're missing a few. No worries. All right, so you're going to have to imagine with me that there are other theaters around the world. Well done. Well done. Not sure how that happened, but we're all good. You get the point. I mean, as Randy said, a domus is a domus is a domus. A theater is a theater is a theater. But there are some that are constructed a little bit differently. But theater actually began here in Athens in the 6th century BC. And it was constructed, and these are the ruins of that in Athens. And very quickly, the theater became institutionalized in connection to a springtime festival called the Dionysia, which was the worship of the Greek god Dionysius. Now, Dionysius was the god of wine. He was the god of fertility, the god of party. Think spring break and all of its debauchery. That may include a ship, and then you've got theater. Now, here's why it became theater. So initially, he's a fertility deity. The god of wine is that he became the god of theater in connection to this festival. This modern film day festival, essentially, was linked to the springtime festival of Dionysius. And as a result of the theater connection connected to the worship of Dionysius, he became the patron deity of the arts. He became the god of theater. In fact, this image in the middle is at a theater that I hope the slide is for in a couple of moments. That's in the theater because he was the god of the theater, and it's front and center on what's called the Skene France. I'll help you to understand that in a moment. So again, you've got this theater in Athens where it began 6th century BC, but Livy tells us that the Romans' first encounter with theater was actually not with the Greeks. It was with the Etruscans, the people group that is off to the northwest of Rome. But what we do find is that the Romans began to engage with ancient Greek theater in the 3rd century when you have the, is it 3rd century? Is it 3rd or is it 4th century? 3rd century. Yeah, right there. This is where when you memorize your notes, there's that fleeting moment where you go, I think we've done a lot of presentations over the last couple of days. And what happened is that as the Romans began to expand and take over the Greek territories, they're now engaging Greek theater, and now Greek theater is influencing how the Romans will do theater going forward. By the way, this is why you keep hearing Greco-Roman, is because the Greek and the Roman world, there's some differences, but there's a tremendous amount of commonalities. And so what the Romans did, though, is they took the idea of theater and they put it on steroids. I mean, they just enhanced, made it bigger. This is one of the most astounding theaters from the entire ancient world, and it's at a place called Aspendos. And this is one of the finest theaters that you will see from the Roman world. Now, this was constructed in the 2nd century AD, but it gives you an idea of what the Romans were doing with theater. If we kind of go into the theater now, I'll kind of walk you through what are kind of the parts of the theater. You look at that and you go, that looks kind of big. How big is that? It is 20,000 people can fit into this theater. How do we know? Because they still hold film festivals here, and they pack in 20,000 people for the film festivals at the theater of Aspendos. Now, the theater structure is this. You have what is called the scène fronts. That is the stage back, the backdrop. And then you have what is called the pulpitum. It's missing here or not in its fullness, but that is the stage here where everything is performed from. But it's not only on the pulpitum, you also have the orchestra. Now this feels confusing to us because when we hear orchestra, we're going, the place where all the musical instruments are. That's not what the orchestra was originally used for. It was additional space for singing and dancing and for actors who were not the main actors to come out from the side tunnels and come and do all kinds of fun, extravagant things as part of the theatrical productions. And then you have what are called, this part is called the prohedria, which is at the very front. Most important people sat in the front. They did not have box seating. Again, where you sit in the theater is an indication of where you are on the social structure. The most important people are in front. The least important people are in the very back. And so the prohedria was the first row or the lower section in connection to what we call the caveas, the ima cavea and the summa cavea. And if there is another cavea, which at times there were 3 sections rather than 2, that's called the media cavea. And so that one is in the middle. Now, I don't have this on here, and I'm not sure if I put this in your notes, so this is a bonus, all right? Right here these are the entryways in and out of the theater. They're called vomitoria, because when the theater production is done, the theater vomits you out of the theater. And so that is called vomitoria. Now, a couple just real quick things that help you to understand what the Romans were doing, because the Romans made in their minds some improvements to what the Greeks had done. Namely, the Romans wanted to make things bigger, more extravagant, more action to what was going on. So one of the things that they did is that they raised the scène fronts. So for the Greeks, it was maybe about half that high, but the Romans go, no, we need a bigger stage back. We need to do more things. And one of the dead giveaways that you are in a theater that is a Roman theater versus a Greek theater is because the scène fronts connects with that summa cavea. Now, not every theater is in good enough condition for you to see that, but they made the stage back bigger, and they said, yeah, that orchestra area is kind of cool, but we'd rather have more action on the stage. So they extended the stage out, made the orchestra area smaller so that they could do more on the stage. Because when it comes to the biggest difference between Greek and Roman theater, it was all about action. They wanted it to be loud. They wanted it to be seen. They wanted it to be spectacular. Now, when it comes to theater in Paul's day, there were 4 types of drama. The first is tragedy. The second is comedy. Now, this is tragedy and comedy as we think of it in connection to classical Greece. In that the tragedy was pulled from the 5th century onward, these classical Greek stories. It was seen as classical even in Paul's day, and it's very much like attending a Shakespeare kind of play. It was about being seen there. It was very sophisticated, but it was probably a bit stuffy, all right? That is what we know as ancient Greek tragedy. Comedy was also a classical form in Paul's day, but comedy is you have a really witty slave that outwits his master. Or you've got the guy who's so madly in love with the girl, he'll do anything and go to whatever length necessary to get here. And there is comedy built throughout, but these were both seen as classical forms in the time of Paul. Still popular, but the popularity was waning significantly because of these next two that were on the rise. You have pantomime and mime. And so I want to camp on these two briefly to give you an idea of what was in vogue in Paul's day. What were they filling the theaters for? It was pantomime and mime that were on the rise. Pantomime is these dramatic performances set to music. Think ballet. Very elegant, very well choreographed. It is stunning in its performance. It's performed by a single actor. That's what pantomime means. It means all mime. They're playing all of the parts. It's one single actor. And you have these movements in the pantomime that were very highly suggestive. Think Dirty Dancing. And when you have these performances that are set to music, there are no words per se, like the pantomime is not speaking, and it's just set to music, then you have to draw on things that people know. So these are known plots from mythology that are performed without words, and so the moment that it begins, the style of music and then the costumes and the stage design, everybody goes, oh, I know where they're drawing this from. It got the audience in immediately, so they didn't have to try to figure out the contextual setting. They were already into the storyline. And you have these elaborate stages, these amazing costumes and masks, and these outstanding special effects. And people loved attending the pantomime, even though they were very highly suggestive. Now, mime took it much further. When it came to these mime productions, you had artists played one character and they did not wear masks. And the reason for that is because it primarily included dialogue. Now, yes, you have dance and music and all of that, but it was very verbally based. And it was incredibly popular among the lowbrow audience due to the groin humor. And some of you are like, okay, I get it. Others of you are like, well, what do you mean by that? It's because it included sexually explicit speech and at times lewd sexual acts on stage. And it was about mimicking people in caricatures that were way over the top. Think Saturday Night Live. Because here's the point. You want everybody in the audience to go, oh no, they didn't. They didn't just say that. Are you kidding me? They actually said that aloud. It was always to get a rise from the audience. And quite often, it was verbal, it was erotic, it was lewd, and it was licentious. And people packed the theater in Paul's day for mime productions. Of note, No respectable woman would ever be seen at a pantomime or mime performance. You would see them at tragedy and comedy. You'd never see them in either of these two because of the lewd, suggestive, sexual movements in the pantomime and the actual speech and acts in the mime productions. And every single self-respecting Greco-Roman city had a theater. And as we've seen all throughout this conference, Paul knows his culture. He knows the context, and he's drawing from things they understood to make points. So let's show you a few connections in Paul as it relates to the theater. Therefore, be imitators of God. It is the Greek word mimetai. It means to mimic or imitate, but it's also where we get the word mime from. So Paul says, be imitators of God, not of those actors that you are seeing, but to be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love just as Christ also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. But sexual immorality or impurity or greed must not even be mentioned among you, as is proper among saints. Like, where's this kind of language happening? Yeah, it's happening at the brothels, it's happening at the pubs, but it's happening in the theater. And where it gets even more clarified is what comes next. And there must be no filthiness or foolish talk or vulgar joking. Some of yours will say coarse joking. Now, this phrase, vulgar joking, in the Greek is just one word. It's eutrapelia. It's called a hapax legomenon, meaning it's only used once in the New Testament with the Greek. And it literally means a turn of phrase. That's what it literally means, but it gets translated as vulgar joking. It's because an eutrapelia, this idea of a turn of phrase, is indicative of what happened in mime productions when there was a shock phrase that was used in the midst of the performance that took something and then they turned it and made it sexual. That's why it says vulgar joking when it literally means a turn of phrase, because it's referring to those shock statements that screamed forth in pantomime productions. And Paul says, this is not fitting. But rather giving of thanks for this, you know with certainty that no sexually immoral or impure or greedy person which amounts to an adulterer has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. This is very, very careful what comes out of your mouth. 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak with the tongues of mankind and of angels, but do not love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Now, noisy gong is two words here in English, and it's also two words in the Greek. The first one is the word kalkos, which is brass gong, and then you've got this word akon, which is noisy. Brass gong that's noisy seems to be referring to the sounding jars that Vitruvius writes about. Now, I have the reference of Vitruvius in your notes, just not up here on the screen. And these have actually never been found in archaeological excavation. That's not shocking, because what these things were is that they were placed on the stages up back against the skene fronds. And when you wanted to have the voice of a god to echo through the theater, you had these big vases or jars that somebody would yell into, and it would echo out and boom forth into the theater. So they did this to hear a voice of a god or some kind of mythical creature. And so when Paul says, If I speak with the tongues of mankind and of angels, but do not love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. He says, you may contend that you are speaking the voice of God, but if love is not emanating forth from you, you may think that you are sounding forth the voice of God, but it's only a theatrical stunt. Love is the indication of what's behind the words. So Paul warns them in 1 Corinthians 13 about this. And then in 1 Thessalonians 1:8, he seems to use it in a really positive way when he talks about the Thessalonian witness. For the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but in every place the news of your faith toward God has gone out, so that we have no need to say anything. Fascinating, isn't it? Let me read this one from Romans chapter 1. We all know, or many of us know, Romans 1 is really intense. Notice what Paul does in the midst of this intense conversation with the Romans. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a depraved mind to do those things that are not proper, people having been filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unfeeling, and unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. The word approve here is this Greek word sunedokio. And it means to join in approval, to join the applause, what was stated of what an audience would do in a theatrical performance, to thank the actors. And Paul says here, there are those who not only do all these things, they're actually joining in the applause of others' disobedience as well. And that brings me just to my final thought here. What was the purpose of the theater? You know, when you think about getting done with this conference and going, man, my brain needs a break, and you head home and you watch a movie or throw on Netflix and you jump into a show or a film, you're probably saying, I just need to do that to unwind. I just want to sit back and be entertained. I just want to let my hair down, which is easier for some of you to do than for others of us. But that's actually not what the theater was designed for in the ancient world. It wasn't just about entertainment. It was actually about education. It was about educating you on a worldview. Because they knew that as people came in and were entertained, they would let down their guard. And so it was in the theater where you would introduce things to help culture know where they're supposed to go. And so the idea was that at any point in time, you wanted to change the course of culture, to shift things and to have them go a certain direction. You would introduce those culture-shaping ideas first and foremost into the theater, because the goal of theater was to entertain you into a new education. And things haven't changed over the last 2,000 years. Because if you want to change culture, if you want to push the envelope, if you want to take something that is taboo in society and make it normal, create an award-winning show on ABC or Netflix and watch how fast culture will adopt it. At first, they will be shocked by it, but over time, it becomes normalized. And one of the ways in which this is happening in our world and has been true for thousands of years, it's not always, but typically, it's through comedy. Because if I can get you to laugh, I can get you to consider. And if I can get you to consider, I may be able to get you to adopt it. And when it comes to entertainment, we have to be very careful on what is shaping us. Because if we're not, we might just join in the applause of our culture and not the Christ our Christ wants us to be.